So I'm sure that you noticed that the version of the Passion we just read this morning from the Gospel of John was a different one from the one that we read this past Sunday, Palm Sunday, which was from Mark. Each of the four Gospels has a slightly different take on who Jesus is and what he was about. And so each has a slightly different take on his passion. In Mark, Jesus is a lamb being led to the slaughter. Not entirely unwilling to go along with it, but certainly not taking the initiative. He begs his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane to let this cup pass from him. When Judas comes on the scene to betray him, he allows him to kiss him, to give him up, but he certainly doesn't volunteer himself, like we just heard he did in John. And in his trial before Pilate, in Mark, Jesus is nearly completely silent. He says hardly a word. In marked contrast to the story we just heard in John, where it seems like Pilate is the one who's on trial before Jesus instead of the other way around. The contrast between Mark and John climax in what these two Gospels remember as Jesus' last words. In John, there, "It is finished," a veritably stoic end to what has been a rather stoic passion narrative. Jesus may be the sacrificial lamb, but he is leading himself, by golly, to the altar. In Mark, though, as well as in the Gospel of Matthew, we get the bone-chilling cry of dereliction. Jesus, having hung on the cross for 6 hours, screams, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is his native tongue for my God, why have you forsaken me?" A quotation from the gut-wrenching psalm we in the choir prayed moments ago. The key, I think, to really appreciating everything Jesus' passion was about is to keep both versions of this story in your mind, Mark and John at once. To recognize that both versions can be true at the same time. That as divine, all of this was exactly as Jesus intended. That as human, what he faced was terrible and awful, frightening and overwhelming to his spirit. But as the eternal Son of the Father, precisely his human terror, his awe, his fear, and the darkness of Golgotha was what he wanted. This is how God chooses to save us from our sin and from our death, by suffering all of it himself. As we read from Isaiah, words that early Christians came to think described what happened on the cross. Surely he has borne our infirmity and carried our diseases, was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now we have to tread carefully here in figuring out how what happened on the cross saves us. The first mistake many of us make, I think, when thinking about how Jesus saves us is to think that the cross is a transaction that largely doesn't involve us. We think it's something like a debt that we owe to God that Jesus then pays on our behalf, but in which repayment we are otherwise not involved. Jesus pays our bill. And that's just about it. I personally don't think that's exactly the right way to see it. See, Jesus' cry of dereliction in Mark, his moment of feeling forsaken by God, that moment after which, as John has it, it is finished. That is the moment when God takes on all of our God-forsakenness. When Jesus experiences all of our alienation and distance from God, all of our sin, as it were, and he suffers its consequences as he hangs there. As Martin Luther explains it, it's as if God the Father saw our predicament, saw that we had landed ourselves in sin and death, and Luther writes, he sent his Son into the world, heaped all the sins of all humanity upon him, and said to him, be Peter, your denier. Paul, the persecutor, blasphemer, assaulter. David, the adulterer. The sinner who ate the apple in paradise. The thief on the cross. In short, be the person of all humankind, the one who has committed the sins of all humanity. See, friends, it's not just Jesus, it's us who's up there on the cross. Whatever sins we have committed, whatever sins have been committed against us, they're all there in him on the cross. His Father told him not only be Peter, but be Justin. I'll leave you all to fill in your own names. What follows, Luther says, is a wondrous duel in which all that Jesus has taken on in his humanity makes war on the splendor and power of his divinity. Unrighteousness battling with righteousness, evil battling with good, sickness battling with health, chaos making war against peace. And it was a strange and dreadful strife when death with life contended, says the medieval hymn which Luther quotes at this point. It is we who hang there in Jesus on the cross. And it is only by dying with him and letting our sin die in him that we can be put in transit to the life of the resurrection. This is important because I think a lot of people think religion is pretty easy business. It's something like, your life is horrible now, but you'll get pie in the sky tomorrow. They've just never been to a Good Friday service. Christianity has no pie in the sky. It is only through, not around, death and suffering. And the sort of life that Jesus inaugurates for us in the here and now, the life that carries Good Friday around in the body, to paraphrase St. Paul, is no picnic. It's perfectly possible not even to find it very attractive. I made a big deal just a moment ago about the fact that God chooses to save us through the cross. God presumably could have done so in any variety of ways, but God chooses, God elects this one. I emphasize this because I think the cross has a great deal to teach us about what it means for God to be God and for us really to be human. The God revealed to us in Jesus, though omnipotent and almighty, exercises power only in weakness and only wins by losing. God doesn't just snap God's fingers in order to fix the world, nor does he simply subject the world to some awful apocalypse, such as we see in the never-ending stream of end-of-the-world flicks put out by Hollywood these days. God fixes us only by suffering with us, and only judges us by being judged in our place. We might call this God a wimp. And that's really the choice before us. Do we think the God of Jesus is a wimp or a hero. In Jesus' passion, we see what it looks like for the divine mode of life to be lived out in human form. And in our world, it looks like someone who is betrayed by one of his friends, but who then doesn't condemn him. Like someone who rebukes the use of force even when it's done in order to defend him. Like someone who doesn't strike back even when he's assaulted unjustly. Like someone who asks his Father to forgive those who execute him in the midst of his execution. Like someone who, even at the height of his suffering, was still thinking of everyone else, making sure that his mom and his best friend were going to be okay after he died. Love. And I don't mean Hallmark card love. I mean the love that lays down its life for its friends. That love is the only answer Christianity has for evil. Forgiveness, our only answer to transgression, and sacrifice, our only answer to violence. We are a people of the crucified. And this is incredibly difficult for us because we live in a culture that worships winning and which is enthralled by the remarkably seductive idea that violence is the real answer for violence. That the only way to beat the bully is to punch him back. That the only way to stop school shootings is to make sure we can shoot the shooter first. That the only way to deter a nuclear threat is to ensure we can beat them to it. That the only answer to a threat is force, and the only road to justice, revenge. Jesus' is an utterly different way of being human than the one that we are accustomed to. And friends, we don't have to buy what he's selling. But it is what it is. Forgiveness and sacrifice, limp and lifeless, hanging from the tree. With no form or majesty that we should look at him, nor anything in his appearance that we should desire him. The only way Jesus can bear the cost of his suffering, and the only way we can bear the cost of actually following him, is because of who he is. The question before each of us, each Good Friday, is, do we even want him? Amen.